start. Good afternoon, everyone. This session is about inequality. The term inequality is often used in the international context to describe disparity in income, disparity in wealth in society, and also among states. We can say inequality is a global challenge for our time, not least because the problem, the phenomenon, is evident in all countries, both in the developing and the developed world. If you think about it, Sustainable Development Goal number 10, to reduce inequality within and among countries, is more relevant to developed countries rather than developing countries. That's probably why the SDGs are often called universal. In 2008, or 10 years ago, the richest 1% of the world population owned 42% of the world's wealth. 10 years later, today, the same 1% own over 50% or half of the total wealth. Inequality has always been with us in human history. Ever since humans studied economic activities. What is worrying now, however, is the trend, the fact that inequality is growing very fast. Some have argued that technological progress will naturally enlarge the entire share of wealth and benefit everyone, thereby contributing to reducing inequality. In reality, however, while we have enjoyed the most spectacular advances in science and technology in human history for the last few decades, numbers have shown that the gaps have been consistently widening in wealth and income. How do you explain this? I don't know if any of you are poker players. I am a poker player. In poker games, you can play either the high-low split game, which means there are always two winners every game, or the highball game, which has only one winner. Whichever rule is applied, a good poker player eventually wins money. I think poker is more about skill than luck. You might not agree, but good poker players eventually win money, and that should be that way. But obviously, no matter how good you are, if there are two winners at every game, so if you play high and low split game, it will take more time until the best player takes all the money compared to the highball game. In other words, the rule of the game matters. The rule of the game in poker can either facilitate or slow down the growth of income gap. Inequality undermines development. Inequality could also give rise to political and social instability. Growing inequality is bad for the rich as well as for the poor in our society. Consensus is therefore growing for collective action to address inequality. The United Nations Economic and Social Council, when I chaired it in 2016, held a special meeting on inequality for the first time and made recommendations on reducing inequalities within and among countries. At this session of Jeju Forum, we have 4 distinguished panelists who will guide our discussion on this crucial issue. Sitting next to me is Mr. Nikhil Seth, Executive Director of the UN Institute for Training and Research, who's going to have a little focus on the global aspects of inequality. And then Professor Jong-il Yu, Dean of the KDI School of Public Policy and Management, will focus on the economic aspect of inequality. And Mr. Eric Iverson, of the Managing Director of the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, will focus on the social aspect of inequality. And last but not least, Professor Ki-Bung Kwan, Rector of the Graduate Institute of Peace Studies, Kyunghee University, will talk with a focus on the political aspect of inequality. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Mr. Seth. Yep.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much, Ambassador Ojun, for inviting me to this panel. I remember your very dynamic presidency of the Economic and Social Council and how much you've done to keep the issue of inequality on the agenda of the United Nations. It sometimes slips away from view, but I do recall very well how much you did to keep this going. And I'm so glad that you've organized a panel here focusing on this issue. There's a division of labor, as you mentioned, Ambassador June, between the four panelists. So I'm going to confine myself to the global aspects of inequality. In other words, why are some countries rich and why are some countries poor? And why is the movement in this development ladder so slow? Why there are only a handful of countries, probably 10 to 12, who've managed over the last 50, 60 years to move up this development ladder? Why is that the situation? But before I focus on global inequalities, there are some general points I do wish to make. First, Ambassador, you mentioned to the wealth and income dimension of poverty, but there are many more manifestations of inequality. And inequality and poverty, I use the word poverty in error. Poverty and inequality are sometimes used interchangeably, but inequality manifests itself in more than inequality of income and wealth. It sometimes manifests itself with inequality in political power and also in inequality in social status. And sometimes people find it very difficult, no matter how much wealth or income they might accumulate, to move up on the social hierarchy. So they find themselves stuck in a certain socially stratified society and very difficult to move up. So that's the first point I wish to make. And also to say that these inequalities of income, wealth, power and social status have their origins in history, as you mentioned, Ambassador. They also have certain cultural dimensions, socio-cultural dimensions. They are based on the inequalities in the ownership of land and capital, on education, knowledge, and more recently in scandalous executive pays, especially in the United States, where we see in Wall Street the kinds of executive pays that are being given. It's mind-boggling. For some of the hedge fund managers, it's in the billions, not even in the millions of dollars annually. These inequalities, and I share your view, Ambassador, are tearing the social fabric of many societies, and they're creating inordinate tensions between countries. The other general point I want to make is that tolerating extreme inequalities is bad politics. It's bad for the economy. It's bad for social cohesion and society. And it's bad for the environment. And of course, it's bad for peaceful and just societies. So all the pillars on which the SDGs were based, on which the 2030 agenda were based, inequalities is inimical to the realization of the SDGs. Inequalities and some of the consequences of those inequalities are the root causes for discontent, for civil strife, for migration and violence. It has its roots, as you mentioned, in thousands of years of world history, but there is no reason in our contemporary world to accept, to justify and perpetuate this with the argument that inequality is somehow inevitable. The next point I wish to make on a general nature is that good global citizenship commits us all to collectively work for helping meet the hopes, the aspirations and dreams of those who are furthest behind, and help dispel the fears and anxieties of many. This is what was inbuilt in the DNA of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. Tackling inequality is everywhere in the agenda, and not only in Goal 5 and 10. 5 spoke of gender equality, and 10, as Ambassador recalled, inequality between and within countries. Because people refer to these goals because the word inequality was specifically used in these goals, but the goals of providing food for all, water for all, energy for all, education for all, ending poverty everywhere, targeting a growth of 7% for the least developed countries, housing for all, gender equality and empowerment, peaceful and just societies for all, are all in essence a call for ending inequalities in their most extreme form. The guarantee of human rights, not only political, but also economic, social and cultural, is omnipresent in the 2030 Agenda. It is a truly powerful agenda for ending poverty, for promoting equality, and for ensuring sustainable development. The third general thing I want to say is that the compulsions on acting urgently on all forms of extreme inequalities everywhere are driven not only by arguments for moral and social justice, but also by enlightened self-interest. As we all know, our world is just too deeply interconnected, and the bads triggered by poverty and inequality, global pandemics, disease, discontent, strife, refugees, environmental degradation recognize no national borders. Fourth, and the final general point I want to make, is that while a country can move up the development ladder in GDP and per capita income terms, that doesn't mean that growth and moving up the development ladder implies greater equality for its citizens. The most dramatic example of this is Equatorial Guinea. Now, you may or may not have heard of Equatorial Guinea, but in the last 10 years, Equatorial Guinea has bounced up the ladder of development because it's found a lot of oil and gas, and they've become a very rich country. But inequalities and poverties in this country has become worse than what it was 10 years ago. So while I'm going to talk about the global comparative aspects of inequality within countries, unless you tackle the issue of inequality very strongly domestically, there's no reason why growth by itself and growing faster than other countries, because that's the only way you move up the development ladder in terms of GDP ranking, will set your house in order. To set your house in order, you have to do many more drastic things to reduce inequality. And many of the speakers who will talk about inequalities within countries will also point to how that those inequalities have to change. Now, in addressing global equalities, I want to try and answer partially, though, the time doesn't allow me for a more detailed exposition of why is it that some countries are poor and others are rich. Secondly, why should we do something together about these inequalities between countries? And third, what exactly should be done to bridge this inequality? And is the 2030 Agenda a good framework for cooperation to end inequality between countries? As I mentioned, the income divide between nations has its roots deep in the history of the world, as are political and the other inequalities that we have talked about. China and India were both once very rich countries 300-400 years ago. They declined. They declined to the bottom of the ranking order, but now they are rising again. Colonialism, wars and conquest, slavery, subjugation were among the major causes for the unequal world up to the middle of the 20th century and earlier. This legacy was perpetuated in more contemporary times with different rates of growth and development powered by education, good health, better health, technology, systems of governance, political systems, asymmetric global balances and institutions, especially the financial and monetary systems, which helped some countries, often called developed countries, move much faster than the rest of the world in the post-war period. In the UN, we subcategorize the countries in the developing world into middle-income countries, least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, small island developing countries. And between these countries, there are great differences in national income, per capita income. But if you look at the historical record, outside Asia, and most of the growth stories have been in Asia, inequalities between countries has not improved significantly. South Korea, ASEAN countries, China, and India, some Gulf countries have moved up this comparative ladder. But you can count these countries on the fingers of your hand. There has been very little movement in Africa, though there's been some movement in Latin America. In Africa, per capita income is 12% of average per capita income in developed countries. In Latin America and the Caribbean, per capita income is about 38% of that in the developed world. And Asia, per capita income is still only 30% of per capita income in developed countries. So inequalities, while not completely static, only few countries, as I mentioned, have grown faster than the developed world, and the others are still treading water. They are still where they've been in the last 60, 70 years. And where this growth has taken place, it has been always a combination of global features and also national push factors. The economic history of this beautiful country, the Republic of Korea, is a telling example. South Korea was illiterate and poor 60 years ago, 50 years ago. But South Korea's growth was driven by trade and effective plugging in by South Korea into a globalizing world. It enjoyed, of course, major global support and protection, but internal changes from a mostly illiterate society to the most educated country and internal governance and reforms allowed ROK to rise faster in the development ladder. Building human capital and economic infrastructures enabled ROK to benefit from globalization. The story of the North, just as a comparator, is much more static and a relative slide rather than an advancement, especially in comparison with the South. Thus, while the global environment, and this is the point I'm trying to make, is crucial, national, political, economic, and social reforms allow for reducing global inequalities between countries. The one feature which stands out most strikingly in countries that have grown up this development ladder is international trade and the trading system. Most of the success stories that I know, South Korea, China, India, the Asian tigers, and Vietnam, which have had growth rates, and of course Qatar and other Equatorial Guinea and others who've grown on the strength of exports of oil and gas, which have grown at prolonged periods for over 7% a year, have been successful trade stories. Others have benefited from trade, but they've had booms and busts related to their trade dependence on primary commodities. Their fortunes have been linked to the demand and prices of primary commodities. The combined impact of distortions induced by subsidies, unequal access to markets, or falls in tariff revenues for some developing countries have resulted in greater global inequalities. Thus, a trading system which is rule-based and fair, taking into account the special needs and handicaps of the poorest countries, would be the strongest force in reducing global inequalities. Similarly, international financial markets perpetuate inequalities. Volatility, difficulty in access to international finance, developed countries' monetary and fiscal policies often oriented to inflation targeting, foreign investments which are often speculative flows into stock markets of developing countries, currency fluctuations, debt overhang, direct investment focusing on primary resource exports are a combination of factors which prevent diversification and growth of poor economies. The ineffectiveness of global agreements to tackle tax evasion, tax havens, and the absence of meaningful tax cooperation further lower the revenue base for poor countries in their efforts towards infrastructure upgradation, human capital formation, and GDP growth. So, the international monetary and financial system is loaded against the efforts of the poorest countries to move up the development ladder. The last element I want to highlight in the reasons for this sort of lack of movement for many of the developing countries is the educational and digital technology divide, which you referred to, Ambassador, which is making the game of catch-up actually even more difficult. As we enter the fourth industrial revolution, we will find the furthest countries being pushed back even further. There's a very strong case for meaningful technology cooperation to prevent the further sliding down of poor countries through this asymmetric growth and application in technology. Why should we then address the issue of global inequalities together as a global community, as global citizens, as interlocked and interconnected governments and societies? The literature is quite profound on the link between extreme inequalities at the national and regional level and unemployment, crime, traffic in persons, exploitation of children, refugees, migration, civil strife, conflict, destitution, and desperation. And there's a pernicious link between the global and national inequalities. The structural constraints from the global level in trade, finance, investment, and debt work their way into the national level, making the task of creating jobs, eliminating poverty, tackling hunger, providing sustainable energy and infrastructure that much more difficult. The diversification of African economies in particular has become very difficult. These pressures lead to many of the bads we see around today, and the compelling reason for stronger multilateralism and stronger cooperation is all around us. It is no coincidence that Africa, which is right at the bottom of global inequalities, is home to many of the conflicts and movement of the largest number of refugees and migrants. The contributing causes for the horrors we see are many, and it would be too simplistic of me to pin all this on global inequalities, but surely addressing global inequalities will level the playing field and usher in global prosperity more robustly. What can we do? Then that's the last question I want to answer. What can we do? The case is there, the sort of logjam we are in global inequality is apparent, but what can we do to bridge the gap? And here I turn to Agenda 2030 and the process itself, which engaged a lot of people, including academia and civil society and the business sector and governments and the UN system. What are the elements in those SDGs which are very relevant to reducing inequalities? And I just wanted to quickly list them because elaborating them will need much more time than I have. First, improve the regulation and monitoring of financial markets. Don't let 2008 happen again. Financial stability is of utmost importance because we know that financial crisis hits the poorer countries much harder than the resilience of the more prosperous. Improve tax cooperation, stem illicit flows, regulate tax havens, promote international rules on profit repatriation. Third, trade rules should protect the export interests of poorer countries. Now we are seeing a tearing up of all multilateral trade rules. That is clearly not the way to go. And a rule-based system where the interests of the poorer countries are protected is going to be very important. Trade is very important for most poor countries. Efforts must be made to strengthen the movement of countries up the value chain, let them produce and move up the value chain on the goods that they export rather than export only primary commodities. The investment regimes have to change in favor of activities which promote sustainable development. Technology cooperation will be crucial. Global institutions need to be further democratized to hear more loudly the voices of the most distressed countries. Indebtedness needs to be addressed along with access to finance in the poorest countries. The cost of remittances must be reduced as promised in the 2030 Agenda. The overall attainment of the SDGs will be a guarantee for greater global equality. Climate change, biodiversity loss, degradation of the marine terrestrial ecosystems impacts disproportionately on poor countries and makes it that much harder for them to catch up. The promise of concessional flows of finance, of aid, of trade and technology must be respected by those who made the promises. Many countries, developed countries, made these promises, and they are beholden to abide and stand by these promises because behind these promises are the hopes and the aspirations of a large number of poor countries and people. At the end of the day, our attitudes to helping countries furthest away will be determined by the political ideologies that are dominant. The role of the countries at the top, the OECD, emerging countries, countries like the Republic of Korea, also emerging countries like China, India, Brazil, and South Africa, we have a especially important role. It is a spirit of cooperation and not competition that will win the day. This will demand moving away from the dictates of the market economy alone and call for non-market concessionalities. But many developed countries have been role models in this, especially the Nordic countries as they're called, and we hope that that is the model that will win and prevail in reducing these inequalities, creating a global environment, economic and political, concessional help to developing countries, and a spirit of partnership will be key to reducing inequalities between countries. But the poorer countries will need to do much more to achieve the goals and targets of the 2030 Agenda to tap into global opportunities. Moreover, the policies to help the poorest countries must be smart and not end up in making inequalities worse within these countries. So to end, I just wanted to repeat again that I have looked only at the global dimension, but the global and the national have to be complementary if we really have to have an impact on the people we are out here to serve. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Seth. We move on to Professor Chong-Il Liu, Dean of the KDI School.
Good afternoon. In a very short time, I have to explain the economic aspects of inequality. Given this theme, I try to cover both the within-country inequality and across-country inequality. However, given the limited time and the fact that Mr. Seth just covered a lot of between-country, across-the-country inequalities, I'll try to pay more attention to within-country inequalities. I will just go over some stylized facts on inequality very quickly, and then discuss the important causes of why inequality is rising so much, and what actions then we can and we should take to reduce inequality. First of all, perhaps those who studied economics heard of the inverted U-curve, which is the observation by Simon Kuznets in the 1950s, which says that he looked at, in the 1950s, he looked at the history of inequality, and he saw an inverted U-curve. Capitalism, we know, delivers dynamic economic growth. But its weakness, the problem is inequality. But don't worry. It's the time of the Cold War, 1950s, right? But don't worry. If you continue to develop, inequality will go down. So that was the authoritative idea about what happens to inequality over the course of capitalist development. But in more recent decades, Thomas Piketty and other economists have discovered that this lowered inequality hasn't stayed there, but increased rather dramatically in recent decades. And if you look at the big picture, now it's more like U rather than inverted U, right? So the trend of declining inequality has been completely reversed, and that has happened. This is the data from the United States, and then they looked at other countries, and of course there is some difference between U.S., Great Britain, Canada, Australia. These Anglo-Saxon countries have experienced quite dramatic increase in inequalities, and European countries not so much. And then emerging countries, emerging market countries also experienced quite a significant increase in inequality. And if you look at the whole, different set of countries and make comparison, it's true that this green line is European countries. The increase in inequality in European countries is less than in other areas, but nonetheless, even there, there is significant rise in inequality. So it's happening almost everywhere. And if you look at closer to precisely how inequality is happening, whether gaps are increasing at different segments of the whole distribution. Amazingly, most of the increase in overall inequality is concentrated at the very, very top. So top 10% income share is rising quickly, but most of that is accounted for the rise in top 1% income. And even in there, the increase of the share of income, the total income that goes to top 0.1% is amazingly high, and so on. So that is what these graphs show. And another aspect of this is that the whole income can be divided into compensation for work, labor services, and income that accrues to people who own capital. And so the labor share means the proportion of the income that comes to compensation of work. And that share has been falling in everywhere in the world, all these countries. And the share of income that accrues to capital, that has been increasing. Of course, capital is a lot more concentrated than labor. Everybody possesses labor, right? And finally, this is global inequality. If you just line up everybody in the world from the poorest to the richest, and this shows the growth rate over the 20-year period between 88 and 2008, and it's the growth rate of their incomes. And this is the famous elephant. Do you see an elephant? Elephant created by Milanovic, and it shows that these are rich country people whose incomes are very high, and the richest of the richest countries, their incomes grew very quickly, and these are the middle class or lower middle class of the rich countries. Their incomes stagnated, right? And these are very upset people who voted for Brexit and Donald Trump and all those populist forces. And these are China's middle class and other, fast-growing emerging market economies. And if you look at these are poor people in poor countries, and their incomes are growing, but not as fast as Chinese middle class or American rich, so to speak. But this is growth rate. If you look at the absolute gains, because 5% growth of very rich people means in absolute terms, their growth increase in income is huge, right? But even if your income grows like 10% and your base is low, then absolute gain is very small, right? So if you look at the absolute gains, this is what happened. The global income getting more and more concentrated into those people who are at the very top. Even the Chinese middle class who gained a lot in terms of the growth rate, their absolute gains are not so impressive. So that was a very brief overview of what happened in terms of the stylized facts on inequality. Why is this happening? There are a few things that economists look at. One is technological changes. Skill-based technological changes means technologies are changing in such a way that if the firms demand more highly skilled labor and they demand less of unskilled labor. So if you possess a lot of education and skill, then your compensation, your salaries go up. And if you are not so lucky, then your wages are held down. And there is also capital labor substitution. You may be hearing a lot of alarming stories about how artificial intelligence is going to displace all the workers. And so it's, human labor is being substituted by capital, and we lose jobs. Robots are kicking us out. This is one way of one important reason for the increasing inequality in the labor market. Another is globalization. China effect, for example, of course, it's not limited to China, but China and other countries with a lot of cheap labor supplies cheap labor to the global market and thereby hold down the increase of labor compensation. And globalization also increases the mobility of factors of production, but capital is a lot more mobile than labor, so capital gains in terms of bargaining power over labor, and that probably has something to do with the fact that labor income share is declining everywhere and capital income share is increasing everywhere. And within countries, this has happened, at least in advanced countries, this has been a very dramatic phenomenon, rising monopoly power. I don't have time to go through the details of these graphs, but this is the thick line is the concentration ratio. That is, within given industries, the market share of the largest companies. And in earlier period, and the line next to it is in more recent period, and in almost all industries, concentration is rising. Mergers and acquisitions, and in other ways, concentration is rising, and the return on invested capital is rising, and that is a lot of that is because of rising monopoly power. They can charge higher prices. And this is an estimation of monopoly wealth. Because they are able to make lots of profits, stock prices are rising, so the rise in the stock market wealth. A lot of that can be accounted for by monopoly power, not the fundamental productivities, but by the ability to charge high prices because of monopoly power. That means consumers and workers are losing out. And on the global aspects, Mr. Seth has told us about it quite a bit. So I'm just going to point out that the global convergence that should be happening has not been happening for a lot of reasons. And if you look at the convergence basically says if you are poor today, you should be growing faster. And the gap between today's rich countries and today's poor countries should be narrowing down over time. And that, if that is happening, then the initial level of income and the subsequent rate of growth should be inversely correlated. But we don't see that, right? It's all over. So the convergence locally, it may be happening in some areas, among some countries, but overall, we're not seeing that because a lot of poor countries are being trapped into various difficulties which prevent them from converging to richer countries. And finally, what can we do? What should we do to reduce inequality? NATO is not about North Atlantic Treaty or something. I don't know. What I mean by NATO is no action, talk only. You know this, right? This is Mr. Obama declaring that inequality is the defining challenge of our time. This is Davos Forum. Inequality is the greatest challenge facing the global economy. But talk only, no action. The consequences is Mr. Trump, Brexit, and all the populist forces, the rise of protectionism that Paul Krugman talked about this morning, and so on. So we have to stop just talking about it and get to action, real action. What are the real actions? We have to deal with the technological changes and the rise in monopoly power that are producing these adverse consequences in terms of inequality. We have to help people with education and redistribution. Those who are being hurt by technological changes, and rising monopoly power, they should be helped by better education, job retraining, so on. And there should be better taxation on the monopoly profits and those who gain enormously from these changes, and they should be redistributed to help people. They are talking about robot tax and wealth tax and more progressive income tax and so on. And help redistribution can take traditional income maintenance programs, or now more and more countries are being interested in basic income and other schemes. But anyway, it takes place. We need this. And addressing monopoly, we need to take newer. A lot of this rise in monopoly power is related to digital technology. And the outdated regulations of the governments are, in a lot of cases, helping to increase monopoly power. So we have to address these problems. And dealing with globalization, this is something Mr. Sess already explained a lot. So I'll just be very brief. Reviving multilateralism and reforming global governance in terms of international finance and trade. He talked about better global cooperation where we can deal with migration and taxation and technology transfers in a more rational way, and compensating losers of globalization in better ways, and promoting global inclusion in terms of actually, real commitment and effective achievement of SDGs. These are things I think we can and we should be doing. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Yu. The next is Mr. Eric Iverson, Managing Director of the Wisconsin Foundation.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Jeju Peace Institute for this absolutely fantastic forum. Thank you to the ambassador for inviting me to be on this panel. And thank you, everybody here, and particularly to the students. I think the world, we have forever dealt with these problems well before our time. Many of us who are now getting a little older in our career have messed things up a little bit more. You are certainly our future, so thank you for being here and listening, participating, and learning. I have spent most of my career in Seattle, Washington. I now live in Wisconsin, in the middle of the United States. I'm running an organization that manages all of the technology coming out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a very prolific university in the United States. And my job with the team that I have of about 80 people is to try to get those technologies into the hands of people to commercialize them, have an impact on society, but also to generate more money so we can fund further research at the university. What I'd like to address today is really one suggestion as to how inequality might be addressed. It is a hyper-complicated issue. There's social questions, political questions, economic questions. But I suggest, and in the experience that I've had, and I'll tell you just a little bit about it, I believe one way of addressing inequality is to support small businesses, not simply providing handouts or foreign aid, which is vitally important, I have to say. But we can complement that foreign aid in philanthropy through the support of small businesses. I'll give you some examples, and we'll talk about it a little bit. My background, I spent many years at the Gates Foundation with Bill and Melinda Gates, addressing health issues, health disparities, agricultural issues. And I did help build the global health program there. And I also, in the time, Bill Gates and Melinda asked me to set up an internal venture fund to support small businesses because they concluded that simply providing grants to develop a vaccine or a drug or a new agricultural product was insufficient. They really felt that they needed to support small companies so that they can build economic engines and sustainable solutions. also, I noticed that in my time there, the most successful in the shortest amount of time was a microfinance program that they instituted, where they would provide very small sums of money, not in the form of grants, but they were supplying loans to people. It could be $100, could be $1,000 to start a small business. And this social pressure to make that money work was enormous, and it was very, very, very successful. I also have spent a lot of my career with the World Health Organization on access to medicine issues. I also ran, well, before I get to that, I've also spent a fair bit of time on expert committees with the U.S. Department of Commerce. I advised the U.S. Department of Commerce on intellectual property issues on trade negotiations, particularly with respect to treaties. And when the Trump administration came on board and trashed the entire trade system, particularly getting rid of the TPP, I stepped down because I figured it would just be a waste of my time. I ran a research institute developing vaccines and drugs, and what I did in that in my period of time, it's called the Infectious Disease Research Institute. I took technologies and I built a company down in Cape Town, South Africa. I figured that we're done colonializing the Southern Hemisphere, so I took vaccine technologies, built a company in Cape Town, hired a woman to run it as a CEO, and I hired a set of African scientists who now run it. I sit on their board of directors, but I've never been an employee. I just wanted to make sure that we could build a company down in Cape Town to be a sustainable solution. So I strongly believe that that is one approach to addressing inequality. As a side note, when I moved to Seattle in the early 90s, my wife in the early 80s, Seattle was a very different place than it was now. It was a city of farmers. It was a city of fishermen. That's the people I represented in my early legal career. I remember very clearly the very first Starbucks stand on a corner. You just walked up to it and got your coffee. There were no other Starbucks. Amazon didn't exist. I remember the very first day walking into somebody's office and they had bought a book online. And I thought they were foolish. Amazon didn't exist. Starbucks barely existed. Expedia and all these other companies. And in a very, very short period of time, the economy just went through the roof. All these companies just boomed, as we say in the United States. They became unicorns. And as a result, I have to say that a lot of people became very wealthy, and the standard of living in Seattle rose dramatically. The standard of living throughout the United States rose dramatically. And so as much as I advocate the support of small businesses, it's also a word of warning. They have absolutely killed that city for purposes of being able to allow the arts community or other people who don't make a lot of money cannot afford to live there. I left Seattle a couple of years ago, and I'm just astounded at my friends at the price they have to pay simply to have an apartment, let alone go to the grocery store and put food on their table. And that's Seattle, Washington, a very, very different city. So I am a strong advocate of supporting small businesses. But I also say, let's be really, really careful as to what's going to happen, because it's compounding the problem. And it's happening real time. And how we address this, I don't know. But it's something that we certainly have to address. So with that said, let me get into my slides, if I can operate this correctly. The organization I run, I mentioned, is called the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation. We manage all the technologies out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It is one of 8 educational institutions in the United States that spends over $1 billion in research and development. We have a lot of technologies under development. My organization manages 3,000 technologies. I also manage $3 billion in cash. So I put that money to work to support small businesses. And I don't care if that business is created in Seattle, if it's created in Madison, Wisconsin, if it's created in Mumbai, India. I am good with that. As long as we take technologies, convert them into products, and get them to the marketplace. In the meantime, hiring people and building value. What has happened in the United States, I have to say, and I note here with WARF, the organization I run, is the first of its kind. It's been around for about 100 years. And we have people visit from educational institutions all over the world, from Africa, here in Asia, of course, and otherwise. But we are increasing our activities globally, partly because that's my career and I'm demanding it of my people. The U.S. certainly has been a concentration of wealth for a long time. Bless you. Silicon Valley resonates with everybody globally, and many people with the United States, many cities in the United States want to replicate and be another Silicon Valley. I really don't want to be another Silicon Valley because most people can't live in Silicon Valley. It's just too darn expensive. But it represents something, certainly to the United States and the world. And what I found heartening, about a month ago, the Wall Street Journal on a cover article noted that there is a increase in venture capital and support of new companies well beyond Silicon Valley. And in the past 10 years, particularly within China, the amount of venture money available to start businesses and support people in the inception of new enterprises is increasing dramatically. So, and 40% of venture capital in 2017, the amount of total venture capital put to work was $154 billion. 40% of that came out of Asia, with the vast majority in China. Over the past 10 years, the amount of venture capital out of China has increased by 15 times. In the U.S., it's only doubled. Now, granted, you're talking about a sheer dollar figure, so doubling is a huge amount of money. But this represents a dispersion, if you will, of venture capital that's being put to work. And by very definition, venture capital is supporting small enterprises. Sure, some of them are valued enormously, like an Uber, but the vast majority of companies that are funded with venture capital are very small. And the very small companies represent the largest number of employees or employment in the United States, and I suggest that's probably the case worldwide. The second component at work is research and development. It's a busy slide, but what it's pointing out is that the size of the bubble, each one of those bubbles, represents the relative amount of R&D spend by each of these countries that has its own bubble. On the x-axis represents the percentage share of a country's GDP that they're spending in R&D, and the y-axis is the number of researchers per million. And I was very pleased to see this. Of course, you would expect the U.S. and China to be very large bubbles simply because of their size of their economies. But you see that South Korea and Japan are really knocking it out of the park as far as the amount of R&D that they're spending relative to their GDP. So sincere kudos. The Asian countries are certainly representing a significant amount of R&D spend to develop new technologies that then could become the basis of a new startup company. What we're certainly seeing is that there is a shift. About 10 years ago, it was largely in auto and biotech and otherwise. And as we all know, it's now a significant shift towards information communication technologies, otherwise referred to as ICTs. I read a statistic saying that an estimated 60% of children born today will work in jobs in 20 years that don't exist today. And that is absolutely astounding as one thinks about how they're going to design and develop their career. But it also tells us that we as world citizens need to support activities that perhaps don't even exist yet. So why is it important that we support small businesses? Here's my animation. Yeah, go ahead. Let's start this. And Gapminder, on the bottom is the income. On the y-axis is the life expectancy. And what you see over time is that as income rises, so does life expectancy. There's a direct correlation that the more income somebody generates, the greater life expectancy and standard of living that they have. And so what that says is also that life expectancy and health, and we saw this at the Gates Foundation quite a lot, is that as you increase your DALYs or you reduce your DALYs, your disability adjusted life years, as people get healthier, they are at work more, they generate more income, they're able to start a business, and there's just simply to my point, there's a direct correlation of increased income to increased life expectancy and quality of living. I have spent a lot of my time with the world's largest philanthropy at the Gates Foundation. I've spent a lot of my time with multilateral and United States, particularly institutions as they provide aid. It was interesting during my time at the Gates Foundation, even Bono of the rock band U2 noted, and he is a prolific advocate, particularly to reduce debt loads on countries, saying that foreign aid is not the answer. Foreign aid is actually a Band-Aid. Really the solution, and he chuckled at himself because he's a rock star, he shouldn't be a capitalist, is that free enterprise is in fact a cure. So we need to empower and support each other with respect to building businesses. And again, it's not the fait accompli. It's not the answer. It is simply a complement to otherwise foreign aid being provided by countries. But there are hundreds of academic studies looking at the impact of foreign aid, and it is quite inconclusive as to how impactful it is, particularly on a dollar-by-dollar return for what we might call an investment. I found this particular study by the Legadum Institute, where they correlated specifically entrepreneurship to prosperity. And entrepreneurship and opportunity certainly closely correlates to a nation's prosperity, that they particularly noted that was the case. Let me say that again. In conducting their studies looking at prosperity of countries, they found that entrepreneurship and opportunity, that is business opportunity, correlates more closely to a nation's prosperity than any other factor that they have studied. And they noted that the greatest advances have happened in the Asia-Pacific region, noting India, China, Pakistan, and Indonesia with particularly high percentages. And what that little graphic, that 2.6, and all those little notes are, is a series of factors that they take into account. I'll also say that with respect to small businesses, in addition to hopefully increasing income, but really most importantly increasing what one would hope would be the middle class. We'll hear from our final speaker on this point. What's happened is over time, these unicorns have caused the income of a select few people, and even in Seattle, the select few is in the many thousands, who all of a sudden have net worths of hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, creating this massive, massive divide between people who are at the lower end of that socioeconomic scale, increasing it so that even those people who were at the bottom 20 years ago were living just fine in apartments, but now they're outpriced by the people who are extraordinarily rich. But the small businesses, in my experience, what I've seen is that even you don't have to be the owner of the business. If you're just an employee of the business, you have a greater sense of autonomy and independence in decision making, and you help make decisions at a business so you have greater fulfillment in your professional life. And as I noted before, the vast majority of employees in the United States are employed by small businesses. The World Bank noted that when they looked across high income, middle income, and low income economies, they noted that in high income economies, the greatest factor is the human value factor, which is measured by the lifetime of earnings. In short, what this is saying is that when you look at people within high-income economies, really the economy is generated by the income of the individuals. It is not the natural resources or the production, the machinery and buildings and urban land and otherwise, which certainly play a part. But you see in low-income economies, those economies are so much more reliant on natural resources. So what I'm saying is we really need to support individuals and their lifetime earnings, as economic health is certainly dictated by the human capital. The way that we do that, I believe, is by investing in education and continued research and development so that we have further advances. That is necessary, I believe, to sustain economic growth. Just quickly, it's just a quote. Noting, I note that small firms have an innovative advantage. That is, small firms can innovate much faster than the large corporations of the world. They move more quickly. They come up with ideas. And I believe that's also because they work in small teams. That is, that professional fulfillment that employees have by working in small groups. And then they hope to be bought off by larger companies that would generate additional income. It's also interesting to note, and I'm reaching to the end here, is that my colleague a little bit ago was mentioning the globalization, and we're seeing a decrease in that. I'm a very, very strong advocate of global economies. We should be able to trade with each other freely and as much as possible. As of this past year, more than 20% of small medium enterprises were trading internationally. That's an astounding number, that a very small company run by a few people can trade their wares anywhere in the world, or certainly in many countries throughout the world. So another aspect, in addition to private capital, in addition to research and development, what's also really important is the political will to help support small businesses in their inception. When I built the company down in Cape Town, it took 2 years to do what I could have done in the United States in a matter of months. It was excruciatingly slow to start the company. And I wanted to get it started to continue the development of a vaccine, but I wanted to hire people. And I couldn't hire people because I couldn't get the company started. It took forever. And I found these statistics, which is one specific statistic that I read was that 3,200 reforms in the business environment of 186 countries around the world were recorded in 2017, saying that the political will is to shape their economies such that they allow the creation of new companies. And what this graphic is saying is that back in 2004, so about 14 years ago, it would take more than 2 months to get a company started. Now it takes less than 30 days. That acceleration, that 30 days is important largely because it helps show that there's political will to make this happen. Now, there's far more that we need to do for sure, but some of the statistics show that more than 50% of adults who joined rebel movements cited unemployment as a reason. I believe if we help use some of the capital being put to work to support businesses and employ more people would address some of that problem. 60% of people ages 15 to 24 worldwide are jobless. The vast majority of entrepreneurs I know are in their 20s. Female enterprises still lags dramatically. It is an absolute shame on the disparity, on the gender inequality when it comes to income. There was, I noted in a specific statistic that if women currently employed were paid the same amount as men in the same job, that there would be an increase by $160 trillion to the world economy. It just tells you it's an embarrassment on the gender equality that we absolutely need to fix. Lastly, 1% of U.S. foreign aid goes to promoting entrepreneurship. That, I think, needs to be fixed. I think much what the United States does to apply foreign aid is wonderful, but they need to generate that towards entrepreneurship. Finally, I'm just going to scroll through this very quickly. I believe education is at the heart and soul of everything we do and the future of all of us. What these are saying is $1.3 trillion to the U.S. gross industrial output came because of technology transferred out of universities. $591 billion of the U.S. GDP is as a result of technologies out of universities. 4.3 million jobs are as a result of technologies out of universities, and over 11,000 startups in the United States are as a result of universities. We have to support the education system. That's what I have. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Iverson. Last but not least, Professor Ki-Bun Kwan, Rector of GIP, Kyung University.
My point is mostly catching up with the Mr. Seth. The reference to might be the difference between inequality and poverty. They not used interchangeably, but actually may not be in the same thing. And also, the Iverson talked about the importance of small businesses, and I trying to make an argument that why small business is very important and critical for us to pay attention to. And there is a serious dangers actually looming large to us as this danger is the crisis of democracy that I see it. Actually, thanks to the Ambassador I was assigned to look into what would be the political implications of inequalities. Actually, it was a great educational moment for me, and as a political science, most of the times I took the inequality as economical issues, and so the economists will take care of it sometime, someday. The business will do provide the cures. But as a political scientist, actually, it has to be not just left to the economist or businessman, but we all have to be concerned. Otherwise, we might actually seriously damage the community, the kind of political system we have. So I'll show why I think that is the case. But is the first part? I'm sorry. Oxfam today even actually the reports that the 82% of the wealth created last year went to the richest 1% of the global population, while the 3.7 billion people who make up the poorest half of the humanity got nothing. And also the alarming fact, second is last year we saw more billionaires created, one more in every 2 days, and the wealth increased by 762 billion. In the meantime, over the last decade, ordinary workers have seen their incomes rise by average of just 2% a year, which is very alarming. And also it estimated around 56% of global population lives on between $2 and $10 a day. But there is no sign that the awareness of inequality is increasing globally, and its political significance in particular. Instead, the typical liberal response we hear from the media, and that's what I think that's the main reason why we don't pay much attention to it, is that what is really actually at issue, they argue, is not inequality. They say just poverty. Talking about inequality simply diverts our attention from what is most troublesome for many, that is certainly the poverty. That's true. That is truly the case. People are suffering from the poverty. And also they argue that people can be unequal by nature and opportunities, but over time, as long as the equality of opportunity is provided, they say they will be better off and becoming so everywhere. In fact, over the past 1 or 2 generations, child labor rate are down 50%, and global income inequality is down 3%, global gender inequality down 15%, while global longevity and education is up 20%, and global income up 40%. This is UN data. In addition, another group of people argue that the equality is not necessarily good, actually. They say Gini index shows that the Sweden is 0.25 and Afghanistan is 0.28. It's about the same level of equality. Nobody would put the Afghanistan and Sweden in the same categories. But in a democratic context, this somewhat optimistic view on inequality is actually traced back to Adam Smith, I would say. This is the quote I got from Wealth of Nations. What is interesting about his reading of reality and response to inequality is the ratio between rich and poor. He said, the ratio between rich and poor is at least 1 to 500. This is interesting observations he had in 1786. Wealth of Nations is published in 1786. They say they are subject to envy and jealousy of the poor. The rich, therefore, cannot have a safe sleep unless there is a state of, say, civil magistrate that underwrites the rule of law, which has mostly to do with the protection of property right of the rich. So somehow Adam Smith had a very optimistic view. Inequality is a reality, but as nations grow in wealth, the issue of poverty and inequality will be somewhat lessened. This somewhat optimistic view of inequality, however, is not applicable to the times of democracy and democratic states in the past and the present. That is because the numerous propertyless poor peoples can capture the state and use it for their own benefit and against the rich, who are small-numbered, hence outnumbered in electoral influence. That is the reason why Aristotle emphasized the importance of middle class. As you see here, he basically taken it as a backbone of the sound, healthy democratic community at the time was police. And ancient Greeks, actually Athenians in particular, took great care not to create too much inequality. So, between and amongst the peoples, even by instituting ostracism for the dangerous element in a society, which often included the richest. So, in order to avoid the fateful consequences of kicking out of the police in Greek times, in Athens, about 2,500 years ago, the rich and powerful in the police had to act moderate and be cautious of being subject to jealousy and enmity of the public, even agreeing to the redistribution of wealth to the bottom layer of the citizenry as a means of appeasing them and buying insurance for their safety. Similar rationale justification might be found in the contemporary arguments for Charity and Ellen's work for the reduction of income gap and inequalities. Society-wide, redistribution measures, either social welfare or in progressive taxation, is again typically justified as being essential for solidarity and well-being of the peoples and for well-functioning democracy of the countries, mainly in the line of Adam Smith's liberal ideologies. What needs to be emphasized, I want to argue for the reduction of inequality, is not just for the Adam Smithian liberal typical responses and arguments for it, for the wealth redistributions. Economic justifications for the reduction of inequality is largely couched in larger benefits and long-term benefits out of redistributions and reducing the inequalities in the societies. It's a matter of cost-benefit calculations. But there is more reasons for it than economic ones. Political reason and justification for the reduction of inequality is for the sake of modern democracy itself. Democracy requires middle class who can mediate the excess and popularity of upper and lower classes. What is troubling about the contemporary inequality, however, among peoples is not only the increasing number of peoples are falling into the poverty line, and their level of immiseration is getting deeper and deeper. The presumed equal opportunity for the social well-being and advancement is harder to be a reality for the poor, while they be subject to all the deprivations of the economic hardships brings into their lives. More worrisome is the shrinking middle class everywhere, and their frustration and economic loss. This bodes ill for the viability of democracy and its sound functioning in a troubled time of globalization and bitter competition between peoples and among countries. If they are struggling to make ends meet, as most of the middle class now facing, hence sparing no time to participate fully in political process and eventually losing economic wherewithal for freedom and equality. Subsistent bound, you actually not able to be empowered enough to participate and be a sound citizens for the communities. Then democratic excess would not be a check would not be checked and balanced. Democracy means would be basically degenerating into plutocracy and despotism. Or at least it would be vulnerable to whims and anger of the frustrated numerous who are still legally entitled to wield their demagogic power against the established, hence tossing the incumbent and vested ones from the elected office every turn of events, as we see witnessing to almost everywhere in Western countries, in democratic countries in the East. Politics, as a result, become more uncertain and unpredictable, and fall into bewilderment and loss in legitimacy, and more those who are regarded as being tarnished with the establishment and vested interest are tossed out of politics. In their place are political novices called in simply because they are at a distance from the established and without any assurance that they can handle the job well or are qualified to it. Politics will become simply the arena for expressing their anger and frustration, and democracy a means to do so regularly and legally. At this critical juncture, it is worth to revisit and reflect on the Greek democracies of antiquity. One term I want to introduce to you is isagoria, which is free speech. Isagoria was not free speech in the contemporary sense of freedom from censorships, but in the active sense of right and duty to speak out in the assembly of citizens. And the other is stasis. Stasis is meant the chaos, simply. The contemporary democracy has the means and mechanisms that prevent the isagoria from happening and not the stasis from happening. We have to pay very critical attention to it. However we may answer to it, what I need to stress in conclusion is that democracy depends on active citizen participation in political decision-making processes. To make it meaningful, it requires as a precondition isagoria, for which again requires equality among citizens, particularly strong middle classes who are economically autonomous and independent, so that they can voice out freely their opinions without worrying the economic survival. Otherwise, servile dependency befalls upon their fate, and democracy will degenerate into plutocracy and despotism. We have to worry about the future of democracy seriously now, with all the accumulating evidence for the crippling effects of globalization and hypermarket-driven competition on the middle class peoples, the backbone of democracy. As they are pressured from both sides, that is from the richest and the poor, as they take on more burdens of supporting the latter, the poor, and operating costs of running the state, they will be willing to express their anger and frustration more outwardly against the rich and even toward the poor by deserting their responsibility of taking care of them. Hence, they become less responsible, middling ordinary citizens, instead ending up being carriers of a revolutionary fever simmering from the ground up. Who can be sure that the radicalization and fundamentalization of politics in the West and others today is not a symptom of such a democratic crisis that we have witnessed to in the 19th and early 20th centuries around Europe? I think Robert Reich and Joseph Stiglitz worry about inequality is well justified and deserves serious consideration even of those political scientists believing in the end of history hoopla, not only for the humanitarian reasons, but also for the future of our cherished value of democracy. Democracy may be very expensive to have, hard to make it right, but it's worth every penny spent because it will make every one of us great and worthy member of the great community we build together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would the panelists come back to the podium? Thank you very much. We only have about 10 to 15 minutes left. So I think I will just open the floor to the audience so that they can ask questions if they have. The problem with the inequality issue is that when you only have a few $100s in your pocket, and when you look into the show window where the Chanel bag has price tag of $10,000, you know that you are suffering from inequality. But once we start to deal with the issue academically or analytically, it sounds so theoretical and it sounds so out of touch. So how to connect the theory to the daily life so that people can feel inequality is an actual live issue for them is not easy. But anyway, I thank all the panelists for giving us very, very realistic aspects of our aspect of this very serious issue, inequality. Now I will open the floor. You might ask questions if you have or make comments. Yeah, please.
Hello, I'm a student, high school student from NLCS Jeju. Hello, I'm a grade 10 student from NLCS Jeju and currently a high school intern at the Jeju Peace Institute. I would like to ask a question to Mr. Eric Iverson about his speech and presentation. I remember your story about Seattle, and I want to ask a question of where do you think is the balance between such technological development and the people who live there who cannot afford to live there anymore? Thank you.
It's a wonderful question and welcome. Very articulate and intelligent. So thank you. I don't know where the balance is. You know, we're living in an interesting time where in Seattle, over a very short period of time, many thousands, if not tens of thousands of people became mega millionaires. And when everybody's a millionaire, then that's the middle class, and everybody below being a millionaire is poor. and it's a funny thing to say. And I think when we, at least my knee-jerk reaction to inequality, and I bet you many people believe this or conjure in their mind, is a very poor people and very rich people. That's just inequality. And I believe, though, there's all sorts of facets of inequality. Seattle, a very rich city, you can have people making $40,000, $50,000 a year, and for most parts, that's a lot of money for most parts of the world. But in Seattle, that's very poor. I mean, you can barely get by. And you take into account things like health care and all those kinds of things, that amount of money is burned very quickly. And I don't know where the balance is, to be honest. I mean, we're kind of making this up as we go, as we try to think about what does inequality mean, who gets to define it, and who gets to try to figure out how to solve it. I don't have a great answer for you. I really don't. And it's a wonderful question, and it's the right question.
Adam Smith said there are 500 poor people per one rich person. I think that was in the 18th century, and if that's the case right now, I think it's quite acceptable, isn't it? If we only have 500 poor people per...
I gave the data is that what typically we think is somehow as we grow richer and richer, and even the most disadvantaged, the lowest bottom of the people have a better life than most of the 18th century, the rich peoples or tribal peoples in the other part of the world. But the question is, even in considering 1 out of 500, that what he saw it in one rich person there is 500, And in today, the thinking logic has to be not 1 out of 500, 1 and possibly about 5, 10, bottom 10%, 5% thinking that are actually not better off, so need some kind of support. But about 95%, we take it, we think we are in the middle class. We are somehow able to maintain our lives and do our works proudly as proud citizens. But these are the ones actually, in the end, somehow affected. We are not like in the 18th centuries. We are poor, so that somehow the country, the state, make a lot of monies, and rich people give the monies to us. They'll be better off. We will be got help, but we don't take it as a kind of blessings. No longer. What we need is autonomies. What we need is the way to sustain, support ourselves, and keep the independence, and so that I can say to know when the money powers actually force us to sell our bodies, not just times.
If I may add a couple of points. Speaking in terms of being rich and being poor is very imprecise. And Adam Smith's description was, he had no access to, objective data, and it was a very impressionistic picture. And of course, we don't have, precise data on the 18th century Great Britain in terms of income distribution. What we do know is that for most period of human history, level of inequality, not just income, wealth, but political power, and in every aspect, the level of inequality was very, very high. But we have lived through an extraordinary period of relative equality, which was 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And I don't have time to explain why that happened, but anyway, that is what really, gave a lot of people the opportunities. They supported the democracy, and now, even though we are witnessing dramatic technological changes and, creation of wealth, and we have democratic political systems, but somehow we are looking at this alarming increase in inequality and going backwards towards the levels that existed in times of Adam Smith. And we cannot allow this to happen, because that is going to destroy the society and undermine democracy, and we may end up with a really bad society. Now, the second point that I want to say relates to the question raised from the floor. Technological development is always disruptive. It creates wealth, but it changes income distribution. Somebody is hurt, somebody gains a lot. And a democratic society should not leave that all by itself. We have to do better in terms of taxation on those who gain a lot of wealth as a result of these technological changes, and then using that resources to provide more affordable housing. It takes time, right? Housing market takes time, but that kind of public policy intervention is not catching up with the speed of technological changes. But as an economist, I can tell you that there are a lot of technical solutions. It's backing up with the right political will is I think, what is needed here.
I think Iverson makes the point is somehow in his presentations that the any income inequality is not the same everywhere. Actually, some of the Nordic countries and have a much better way of handling inequalities, and the issue is whether the poor and the lower bottom of the middle classes, or below the mean income levels, they are able to maintain their living in an affordable manners, the housing, education, when they have a human capital investment, as we do, as the Western European country, Japan does. Actually, there always comes opportunities to elevate their status and find the ways to get rich even. But these opportunities is getting narrower and slim as incomes got widened. The reality is actually blocking any possible ways for the poor and the middle incomes to have a better life, decent life, I would say.
But if democracy brings more equality, actually 40 years ago in the world there were only about 40 democracies. Now we think there are over 100 democracies in the world. How come the world 40 years ago was more equal than now? What do you think, Nikhil?
Interesting question. Democracy, in the way it's practiced and interpreted, especially in the conclusion of successful elections alone, is not how inequality will be removed. Because I know in many countries, especially in the poorer countries, the election manifestos and promises made at the time of election are very different from the policies that are pursued after people get elected. And the accountability at the next election to the promises that were made previously somehow get sidelined and forgotten. So what we need to do is probably encourage activism and civil society groups who will help remind the political processes in larger and more robust democracies. Now, the issue of inequality resonates very differently, which is quite clear in different countries. And it is very much at the heart of the Indian electoral system, the election process. But it is not, as we were discussing earlier, the same in the United States, where it goes into a more ideological discussion on liberalism versus a different kind of approach to the promises that are made in elections, harping on the free and the more venture-oriented societies. But in India, I've found repeatedly that election promises that are made are not fulfilled, and then the accountability of those is forgotten when they come again with a different set of promises, and they play up to different stratifications and diversity in society, and inequality issue gets sort of pushed under the carpet. But how can we as citizens, as concerned citizens, keep that issue of the promises being made on equality? That's how I think democratic, that partly explains the problem that you encountered, that despite 140 democracies, inequalities have actually increased. So is it that inequality doesn't matter in democracies, or is it just the way in which our politicians and our leaders have played democracy to suit the outcome of elections?
Okay, may I respond to that? I have a little different take on that. A democracy, by definition, allows for freedom of movement, freedom of decision, freedom of capitalism. And as the democracies have grown, people, a very strong entrepreneur is like a professional athlete. There's very few of them. But when they're good, they're really, really good. And a number of them, as we've seen with Bezos and others, with a free society, a few of those entrepreneurs have taken off and built massive wealth. And so I think it's not a political promise that's been broken. I don't think it's a redistribution of wealth taxation issue in the long run. I think what we've seen is a greater democratization of societies that have allowed entrepreneurs to flourish. And it's only in the past 5 to 10 years that we've seen this massive rocket-fueled skyrocket of wealth that's created this massive, I believe, disparity between those who have billions of dollars to their personal wealth and the rest of us who seem left behind in some way. So that's my take. I think we'll have to see how it plays out.
Well, in economics, there is this debate about whether this huge increase in inequality is driven by this phenomenon of super rich, based on the combination of their talent and the increase of market size as a result of globalization and network effect and so on. And so that's superstar theory. Well, it's one aspect of what is happening, but the picture is a lot more complex than that. And actually, Professor Paul Krugman, who gave a talk this morning, was, he put a lot of thoughts into this fundamental question. Of course, democracies deal with inequality. Inequality is generated by economic system. And as I said in my talk, the fundamental reasons for increasing inequalities in recent decades is technology, globalization, and inadequate policy institutional responses to these new challenges. And one idea about the relationship between democracy and these changes is that there's kind of self-reinforcing dynamic. Economic inequalities increases, and that means income and wealth is more concentrated, and it translates into political inequalities. They have a lot more influence on the democratic processes. And for example, campaign financing in the United States is just crazy. And recently, the Supreme Court justified the unlimited spending on campaign, electoral campaigns, in the name of freedom of speech. If you have a lot of money, you can spend that money to influence the political process. That is just, anyway, that is just one aspect of how economic inequality translates into political inequality, and then they make laws and policies that help the richest people get even richer, right? For example, tax reforms that cut taxes for the very rich and so on, and that reinforces economic inequality, and that kind of unfortunate dynamic is happening, and there is urgent need to some kind of dramatic change in that mechanism.
Actually, our time is up. Just one last question, please. The lady here, yeah, please.
대부분 경제적인 어떤 불평등 얘기하는데요. 사실 제가 이거 제주 평화 포럼을 참석하면서 너무 황당했어요. 지금 각 섹션에서 여성분은 거의 없습니다. 다 남성분이 섹션을 주관하고 자장을 보시고 또 연사를 하시고, 지금 불평등도 다 경제적인 걸 얘기하는데 과연 여기서 우리가 불평등을 얘기할 수 있을까요? 여성분은 지금 제가 각 섹션에 갔을 때 거의 한두 명? 근데 여기 지금 참석한 여성들은 거의 50%가 여성입니다. 또 지금 경희대 교수님이 민주주의는 그 소수의 많은 사람들이 참석을 하는 게 좋다고, 그러고 소기업, 중소기업이 늘어나야 된다. 근데 우리나라는 사실은 대기업이 점점 늘어나고 소기업은 점점 줄어들고 있습니다. 지방에서 지금 제주만 해도 마찬가지고, 저는 서울에 있고요. 구멍가게가 다 문을 닫고 있습니다. 작은 기업, 대부분 뭐 신세계 백화점, 이마트 뭐 이런 것들이 계속 커지고 있고, 재래시장은 다 눈을 망하고 있습니다. 이 부분을 좀 더 깊게 다뤄주시고, 제주 평화포럼의 주제가, 지금 현재 섹션의 주제가 불평등이에요. 근데 불평등은 경제적인 불평등만 얘기하는 게 아니죠. 남녀, 여자, 양성평등에 왜 여자는 자장을 볼 수 없고 연사가 없는지 참 궁금해요. 저는 아시아 태평양 호스피스 완화학회 조직위원을 하고 있습니다. 이런 부분은 어떻게 자장님이 얘기하실 건지.
If I may translate her question, she's rather making comments than asking question, and she thinks inequality is not inequality is an issue in the formation of our panel as well, because there is no female participants here. All of us are male, so inequality is not just about income and wealth. It should be about gender equality as well. That's her point. And she also mentioned that in Korea we have a lot of problem with the big conglomerates, and that should be part of the question of inequality. But that was a comment, so I will go to him for the last question. Gentlemen, yeah, please.
Thank you very much. I like a little to rebel against this idea of inequality, how it was presented here. My name is Milan Lajčák. I'm the ambassador of the Slovak Republic here in Korea for 3 years. I've been in Asia for 23 years. And I'm the man that is very happy because half of my life I had the chance to live under communism and the second half in the democracy. So I can compare on my experience how it was. And communism exactly was striving for equality. Equality, and the whole system was based on subduing initiatives of the people in the goal of equality. So now I a little reforming, but my question was, if you consider inequality as the natural feature of the humankind, and even as a part of the prerequisite of the future progress, because without inequality we cannot progress ahead. So in my personal view and its comment, we should talk about the extremes, level of inequality and the scale of inequality. But inequality as principle is the feature that is very, very natural to the humankind. So that's all.
I think what Ambassador asks, I think we are not questioning his assumption. You know, inequality is a kind of driving force in capitalism. Yeah, we all admit that. But we are discussing it because at least during the last few decades, inequality is growing at a very alarming pace. That's the I think core of the issue. And please.
I just wanted to link that last question with what Eric was saying. And once we try and conflate political systems with growth and income distribution, it gets very confusing. Let us look at the history and empirical evidence for the last 20-25 years. And I try to list the countries which have grown consistently over 7%. And these are China, Vietnam, Qatar, India, Equatorial Guinea. Now, of these, I think only one is a robust democracy. The rest can hardly be called democracy, but they have a better record on inequality than India. China and Vietnam definitely have a better record. Qatar is not that great, nor is Equatorial Guinea. So sometimes we tend to confuse these issues, and what we are arguing for is a more equal world, not a perfectly equal world, but a more equal world where the contrast between the billions who don't have anything and the 1% who have 84%, as Oxfam said, is just so unconscionable that we have to do something about it to make our world a little more equitable and a pleasanter place for those billions who have nothing. So that was the approach I think the panel was taking, rather than using it as a system to whip political systems or to say that this one model is better than this other model.
I would say that we have many historical lessons that we learned from the past, and one of the lessons we never forget and try to repeat again is the extreme versions of egalitarian society we had in the Eastern Europe and the other part of the world under the name of communism. But I'm arguing for, in a sense, the material redistribution. Material conditions is very important because without material subsistence is solved, we are not able to further enhance our freedom in other political and social realms. So it's a first step. But to achieve the minimum level of subsistence and the level of dignity, I would say, the level of dignity requires some material redistribution not in the sense of making the whole society egalitarian, equal society, like as we did before, but in the sense of, I would say, the Laurentian liberal, the spirit. When we grow, the growth has to somehow benefiting even the least, the advantageous segment of the society. Otherwise, we cannot say it's a just society. I would say, so my argument is largely for the just society than what we have now as we witnessing to these days.
제가 그 질문하신 부분에 대해서 제가 한 말씀만 드리자면, 그 제가 아까 불평등이 증가하는 원인 중에 중요한 것이 그 독점 현상이 심화되는 것이라고 말씀드렸잖아요. 이제 제가 전체적인 이야기를 하면 이제 자세히 하긴 못했는데 한국에서는 지금 아까 말씀하신 바로 그 부분이죠. 재벌의 그 집중이 점점 커지고 이런 스몰 비즈니스가 점점 없어지고 하는 바로 그 문제가 중요하다고 말씀드렸습니다.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, panelists, and thank you very much, audience. You've been great. Thank you.